everybody today to a very simple demonstration, but this is probably my all-time favorite quilting block. And I discovered log cabin when I was teaching home economics, and it would have been in 1966. And I bought a Ladies Circle magazine, and there was a log cabin block made into a pillow, and I think it was probably cut out of an old quilt. I had no idea what this thing was. And it was on the cover of the magazine, and I saved the cover, and it haunted me for months because I couldn't figure out how you would sew it together. And finally, one Saturday, I had some time and I thought, I'm gonna figure this out. And I knew how to applique, so I kept thinking you just applique everything. Well, then it dawned on me that if I started with the smallest piece, that you just make it bigger and bigger. And I spent a whole day just making log cabin blocks. And you would have thought I'd invented it. I mean, I was so thrilled with figuring this thing out. So log cabin is really one of those blocks that is my go-to for design, and there's so many possibilities with it. And these days, there's patterns all over the place, but you know, if you know the basics of it, which I'm going to show you today, you can make it any way you want. And I brought two antique quilts I have that I'll talk a little bit more about that have different size strips. And I cut a traditional 1.5 inch one to work with on these. And you know, this is a traditional block. This also is a traditional block. And so is this one. So what you're gonna realize is there's all kinds of different ways to play with color and design. Now, the basic one in the olden days, they usually started with red in the center, and red was considered the heart of the home. And if you think, I always then picture this log cabin and think, oh, they just put logs like this and went around and around until they had their log cabin. And maybe that's kind of what they did. So what I start with, and I did 1 3/4 for the center, but you can do, if you did 1.5, it would just be the same size as your strips. But usually I like 1 3/4 or 2 inches. And that means cut, so anytime I talk like that, it's cut. And then you take 1/2 inch off, 1/4 inch on either side, and so it would be 1 1/4. So here is the center, and I have a strip of fabric, and I'm going to take and put right sides together and sew this strip. And let's say I am making 40 of these. I'm just gonna keep adding squares. So you can make this a real production sort of technique when you have multiple blocks alike, or let's say you have 4 or 5 blocks alike and then you make something more scrappy. But I leave my strip full. I don't go ahead and cut what I need. I cut as I go. Now some people think that isn't the right way to do it, but you can do it any way you want, but it works for me. So then when I cut that, I end up with 1 strip on there. And I like to press away from the center. So I'm always pressing away from a former seam allowance. And that to me is really important to not get bulk. Otherwise it can get real bulky. If you're pressing it against the center and you add your next strip, then when you try to press here toward the center, it's gonna get all bulky. And I am one that just tries to really be as efficient as possible. And I was a home ec teacher for 8 years and at junior high level. And so you have lots of entry-level people. And it seemed like I was always doing something the hard way first and then figuring out how to do it easier. And I think that just came from teaching so much. So now I've added a second strip, and on this particular one, I use the same fabric. And when you start using the same fabric, you get this kind of a pattern where you see the same thing, both sides. And then when I went to the next side, I added the same fabrics. So, and I'm making these a little lighter, and I just thought that would be interesting. You can choose to make 2 sides light, 2 sides dark, or you can just mix the whole thing up. And on this one, I have 3 rounds. And so this, when you add it a round in a circle, that's called log cabin in the round. So there's times you'll be reading an article about log cabin and they'll say, oh, log cabin in the round. You'll think, well, what is that? But it just means that you add a piece to one side, go to the next side, and the next side, and you just keep going around. Now, this antique quilt is log cabin in the round, and I love this piece. It's old velvets, but every block is different. And, you know, just looking at what we can see here, you can speculate on what that woman was doing or thinking. Did she pre-cut all of these strips? But she would have just been using scissors in the old days. And instead of doing what I did, she sewed each one to a backing. This is called, all of a sudden it's...
Quilt as you go.
Yes, thank you very much. And Georgia Bonesteel, probably 35, 40 years ago, made this technique into a big thing. But it means you're working on a foundation, and this is a muslin type, and you can see all of the hand stitches. And when I first purchased the quilt, my thought was that I would put a backing on it. And then I thought, no, this is part of the story. And so I've left it this way. And because there's so many fragile places on this, I just kind of use it for special occasions. One time we did a photo shoot out in the forest, and Val had me hold it up, and it was in with, you know, the Christmas trees, all that green, and it was so spectacular. It's my favorite photo of this quilt. So now there's another way to do your log cabins. It's called courthouse steps. And in courthouse steps, you add your strips opposite each other. So here, opposite, then you go here, opposite. So it ends up making this stepping stone sort of effect. And I really like this design too, but I find it feels more formal to me. But I purchased this quilt once at Quilt Market. They always have vendors with old quilts in Houston. You know, I never see that many old quilts here like you do in Houston. But this one, it's very vivid. The center of the blocks are always yellow. And then you can see the dark on either side and the light on either side. And you definitely get that feeling of stair steps. And I really enjoy, you know, this particular pattern because I like what happens from a distance. I don't know if you can see almost a bigger pattern for me because of the way they've been added. And those secondary patterns that you can get in patchwork, I find really fun. And most of the time, I can't visualize them before I start. I have to wait until I've gotten some of it done, and then I start putting them together, and it's this big surprise that there's a secondary pattern. Now there's another way that you can do log cabin, and you can use either method that I showed you, where you circle around or courthouse steps. But I'm using the same fabric all the way around. And I'm going to be teaching a class this fall that is this block. And the first time I made it, I did it in flannel. And it's a scrap quilt, so I made 4 alike. And then 4 more alike. So by the time I have my big quilt, those 4 are different places, so you don't notice 4 alike. But it was really easy to do 4 at once, and I used this method where I am gonna sew 4 of these at once. And then when I get to the next one, I will sew 4. So it's a little bit of streamlining, but I found that this is a very quick method to use. And we have an old pattern that I put together that we're gonna revive so that I can share the pattern with you when I teach the class. But this is something you could figure out on your own too. And I find that there was something about doing this one out of flannel that just made it really a neat quilt. So I'm kind of waiting till we get some flannel in this fall to start a new one. So now I brought one other thing. I've been kind of going through and cleaning out stuff at my house. I know none of you have had to do that, but I'm just to the point, I don't need all this stuff. I bought this at Quilt Market many, many years ago. And those of you who've been quilting for a long time know the name Jo Martin. Oh, no, Jo Morton. She's a fabric designer, and at the moment she's with Moda. She was with Andover for years, and then she went with somebody else, and now she's with Moda. But these are antique blocks, and she is known for her real kind of authentic prints that she designs. And I always like her colors too, because they aren't as flat as some of the older quilts. I mean, there's a little pink in here, there's a little purple, then, that funky kind of gold color. So there's a little bit of everything. And I'll pass this around in a minute so you can take a look at it. But I thought you might like seeing another way to do something with blocks, or if you collect some old blocks. And she did, finish the edge, which makes it kind of nice, but then had it professionally framed. So any questions from anybody? Okay. If you like this video, please like and subscribe.